So just so you know, if you're not comfortable with being recorded, feel free to keep your video or microphone muted or off as you please. So I'm no specialist. I'm no professional or CV. I've taken no courses on how to write a CV or a resume. I'm only talking from my own experience, and also from what I've heard from other people who've been through similar things, applied for jobs. I've actually interviewed employees before for corporate positions, as well as for PhDs and for masters. And I've been in on the interview panels of head of department for a computing science department at the University of Stirling. So I've got some experience from different types of interviews, and of course my own interviews as well, when I've applied for jobs here, when I've applied for jobs in the UK and so on, including even applying for my PhD. So I've got various experiences from different types of jobs, from industry to academia, both on the going to interviews sort of a viewpoint, as well as from the giving interviews viewpoint. So I'm not going to talk too much about the interviews as much as the writing of CVs and about your online profile and presenting yourself online. So the first thing I should mention is, when we're going to talk about CVs, is in the UK, we call everything a CV. It's a curriculum vitae. It's Latin for, I don't know what it means, but it's Latin for saying it's an expression of your qualifications. It's a letter saying exactly what your qualifications are and your experiences and why you're appropriate for the job that you're applying for. In academia, a CV is a lot different to one that you would see in industry. And generally speaking, this is true for anything. When you're applying for a job, you'll want to tailor your CV to be specific for that job. So you'll want to look at what that job is requiring of an employee or potential employee. You want to look at the qualifications required, the personality traits that are required, and all that kind of thing. Even looking at company culture or university culture and mentioning that kind of thing in your CV can be very, very important. So when you start looking at academic CVs, you'll notice that they're not sticking to the standard industry rule of 2 pages. When I was in high school, that was drilled into me over and over again. Your CV must be 2 pages maximum. And I think that makes sense in industry because, generally speaking, in industry, I think 2 pages is more than enough, because you're just talking about your general roles, and I think a title would generally explain everything. Whereas in academia, if you say you're a postdoc or you did your PhD, that doesn't really explain very much. And we need a lot more information there, especially regarding what kind of publications you have, because everything's so niche. So we need to spend a lot more time honing and writing our CVs into being representative of our experiences and our careers. There's different ways in which you can write your CV. I used to write mine in Microsoft Word back in the day. With my experiences growing in LaTeX, as everybody's in academia should be, I've realized that that's a much more professional looking format. And it's also much more accessible for other people to look at and work from as a template, which is nice because I want to share my CV with everybody here. So if you look into the chat, I will give you a view-only copy of my CV there. That's always up to date because that's a dynamic link to Overleaf. For anybody who's not aware, Overleaf is a website that allows you to edit in LaTeX, the programming language, which is used for creating and editing documents that are eventually saved as PDFs. It's like an alternative to Microsoft Word, but except it allows a lot more technical control. So let me just share screen here and actually start showing some of what I want to show. So first of all, I'll show you my CV as a document standalone without the LaTeX beside it. So there's no hard and fast rule as to how the structure must be or the format and layout. Generally speaking, if I've seen a whole variety of CVs out there, some of which are very pretty designs and have lots of color. I've seen people put their pictures on their CV, and I've seen hundreds, possibly even thousands of CVs over the years. And I generally recommend, when it comes to academic CVs, unless you're applying for a design type job, that you keep it fairly simple and readable, and you don't try to add too much flourish. You can make it look elegant without having to add color, without having to add pictures. I don't recommend any of those things because I think that makes you look unprofessional. You could say that's maybe just my personal opinion, but again, if I once received a CV that was written on a pink letter and had red text, and it was hard to read. It didn't consider people who are colorblind, and it was kind of tacky, and it immediately put people off. As much as we like to think of ourselves as truly logical creatures who will only consider the logical aspects of what's on a CV, that's not how we actually are. We're human beings, and how you present yourself in a written format like this is going to be important for how the subconscious of those who are looking at your CV consider you. And if you have something that's overly artistic and kind of unprofessional looking, you will be considered to be less professional, and that's not what you want to. That's not the kind of expression you want to convey via CV. So at the very top, your name, and I like to have my qualification. When I had just had my undergraduate, I had a BSc here instead of PhD, and I think that's perfectly acceptable. I like this because it says straight away, this is what I am. I have a PhD, and that means that I'm applying for a specific type of job. If you're applying for a postdoc position after getting your PhD, they need to know you have a PhD, right? So having that nice and clear at the very start is a good indicator as whether they can continue on or not. You have to remember that the average job, especially in academia, will probably have hundreds of applicants, hundreds. So you are amongst a lot of people. And you know what it's like when somebody like Cedric or Wolfgang are looking at a big pile of CVs. They have so much on their desk already, so many tasks, so many emails to look through. They have so much work on that they will, generally speaking, I'm not saying this is them specifically, but professors generally will not put a huge amount of time into looking at these CVs. They will first glance at them. And if any of them seem immediately to be, inappropriate or, you're missing the basic qualifications, they'll probably discard you or at least put you to the bottom of the pile. So make it nice and clear very early on that you meet the most basic qualifications for whatever you're applying for. And that includes undergraduate going into master's or undergraduate going into PhD as well. You want to make sure that in your CV, you clearly highlight what your specialty is and what you're interested in doing. That's why I think the most important thing you can have at the very start of a document is your positioning statement. Say what you are very briefly so that if they read nothing else, they have a good understanding of who you are, and what you're bringing to the table. So in mine, I say, I am currently a postdoc at Michigan State University, where I focus on the utilization of evolutionary algorithms for genomic prediction, right? That's my main project. That's my job title. That's the university I'm in. Straight away, all that information in one sentence. During this time, I've collaborated on grant writings. That's very important for when I'm applying for postdocs with various professors. It shows that I'm multidisciplinary. I've led a team focusing on a research project of my own creation. That shows leadership skills, which is useful, of course, in any CV, and it shows that you're able to pick up additional responsibilities in your role. Especially if you're going to be doing a postdoc or similar, you're probably going to have to look after some undergraduates, master students, PhD students at some point, or even colleagues and fellow postdocs on a team for a research project. So showing that is a very important skill. I met the research requirements for this grant, which funded my position. Just saying, I got my position really, but talking about grants is always a good thing. I think this kind of discussion shows that you can potentially bring in more money, and that's what universities are based on. They need to be able to fund future projects. So the more you talk about grants and such as a PhD student or as a postdoc, it's very important. And in a similar vein, if you are ever in a position where you can help either write preferably or at least review grants, I highly recommend that. At whatever level you're at, being involved in funding is an incredibly useful thing for your own skill set, as well as for something that you can add to your CV. When I was doing my PhD, I was very lucky to have enough funding for my entire PhD, including travel and everything else. So I didn't need any additional money. At the same time, I knew that this was an important thing for my CV and for my skills, and so I took part in a lot of grant writing, and I also applied for grants myself in order to try and fund research projects. And I had a couple of months postdoc during my PhD that I got because I applied for grants for it. I also got some travel funding just so that I could put on my CV that I had applied for and received funding. It doesn't matter if it's only $500. That still shows you have to start somewhere, and that shows that you can apply for money successfully. And that's a good thing. Even if you're not successful, you should still add it to your CV, especially at the start, because it shows that you're willing to try and do these things. You care about that. That's important. I go on to say I co-supervised a PhD student and presented research and lectures to multiple universities and institutions. Previously, I had supervised undergraduate students, but now that I've helped supervise PhD students, I have that there as well. So you always upgrade it and update it as you go as well. Also, this sort of dissemination of your research is very important. It's something that, in my opinion, being involved in research, the most important thing is to conduct research, but also to be able to share your findings. If you can't share your findings through papers and through presentations, there's no point actually doing the research in the first place. So that's why I make sure I highlight that in my positioning statement at the very start of my CV. So this has been, it's only a few sentences, but I think that's very well crafted, and I've spent a lot of time trying to put that into what I see as a perfect state at the moment. I also have my email at the very start so that people can contact me immediately. And I use my personal email because you never know what job you're going to apply for, and then maybe you won't get it, but you'll move on elsewhere. And that CV might be still sitting in some professor's desk, and they want to get in touch with you, and they might try and get in touch with you at your @MSU, or in my case, my previous @stir.ac.uk email address, which would mean that they wouldn't be able to find me. And that's not ideal. If somebody's considering getting you for a position for a job, you want to be accessible. So I highly recommend using your personal email. Don't use your work email. And actually, I do the same with my papers and grants and presentations. I avoid using my work email personally. I'm not going to say that you should do that, especially if it involves using any data. If you're using any data that's tied to your job, obviously you should be using your work email. But for everything else, I do recommend using your personal. I also have this thing called a Linktree. So for those who are not aware, Linktree is a website that allows you to fill with other links. And let me show you. I'll open up. So here is my Linktree. You can look at everything from my own personal website to my Twitter, to my Instagram, to my LinkedIn. I use this for both my professional and for my personal stuff. So anybody who wants to find me on various different communities, they can do so here. I don't put my personal Facebook on here because that is a truly personal thing that I generally don't want to share with people. But everything else here, I've vetted and made sure that it's professional enough that if I was looked at by a potential prospective employer, that would all be professional enough for them. Okay, so that's the very entry to the CV here. My timeline here is simple, right? I just put the times and what my names of positions and what I've done. So at a glance, they can see what my sort of experience is. And this isn't too important. I think it's important to show that you don't have any major gaps. And if you do have any major gaps, I would still put them in here and mention why you had a gap, or especially if it's something that's going to be experience related. I had a colleague back in Stirling who left academia for 6 months because they wanted to go and be a chef in the Antarctic. They worked on base in the Antarctic and minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures. And that was a life experience. And they had no problem writing, I left academia for 6 months because I wanted to enjoy a life experience. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think if you hide what's on some of your time, that's a bad thing. But I think it's okay to say what you were doing in that time. But here's everything I ever did. I also include the teaching assistants separately to my PhD studentship. Showing that you do teaching is a very useful thing, and that goes to undergraduates as well. If you can, especially in your final year, if you can do some teaching alongside, that puts you in a good stead for getting into a graduate program. It shows that you are particularly eager, and it means that you're knowledgeable enough that you can teach. Nothing really. You don't learn so much. You learn more teaching than you do in any other format, in my opinion. If you're teaching first year computing, it really solidifies your own personal understanding of computing, for example. Okay, as a postdoc, my publications are pretty much the most important thing for me right now. Once you become lecturer sort of level, you would probably put your grants and funding above this, because right now my grants are really just, I have applied to several things and have gotten some small grants. It's not the number one thing. It's not the most impressive thing. So I put my publications first. At early stage in your career, you put all the publications you have, all of them. And if you have very few publications, like maybe just one or two, I would put something like, if you have any pending, you can put that there as well. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Also put in your thesis if you have that there. You can also put your undergraduate one here as well once you finish that. If you have a dissertation, you can put that in here for sure. Eventually, when you become professor level, you don't put all your publications because that would end up being 20 pages long. Instead, you put something along the lines of highlighted publications, or the ones that are relevant to the job that you're applying for. So this is the kind of thing that you need to configure per job as well. Of course, if you want to apply for industry, this is for academic CV writing this session, but if you want to apply for industry, you still might want to have this in, but maybe not so prominently. This might be something that comes later on in your CV. Like I said, the grants are very important, so make sure you have this in, and this includes having pending grants. So I have 2 pending grants on here at the moment. They say that I have applied for grants, and that shows that you know how to at least write them, and you have experience writing them. That's a good thing, even if you're not successful. And that's the point as well, actually. If this fails, I'm still going to keep this here. I still want to say that I was a named researcher on a grant because that means that a number of professors have decided that I'm good enough to be a named researcher on a grant, regardless of whether it was accepted or not. That speaks volumes, in my opinion. Down here, I have my research experience. This is where I go into a bit more depth. I have individual projects here. This used to be by postdoc and by role, but I think anybody who's experienced postdoc life quickly realizes they don't actually work on a single project. So this is multiple projects across multiple postdocs. You mentioned you don't have to go into the publications here since that's done above. You mainly want to talk about the main goals and purposes of the project. This is almost from a grant perspective. So what was the purpose of the project? This is more abstract and higher level. So I've got a few of these in here. I'm not going to go into any particular detail. I then mentioned my PhD. For now, that's still relevant. I think eventually, maybe in 5 years' time, I'd probably reduce this section. But because I'm still a fairly new postdoc with only 2 years experience, I still mention my PhD here in detail. Teaching experience, I think this is very, very useful. Again, if you're applying for jobs from going into postdoc, going into PhD, or going into lecture, you want to show that you have a teaching experience. And that includes all the different roles within teaching. So don't just say that you were a TA, right? That's not really describing much. Describe all the different things you took part in. Describe your personality traits and what you've learned from these things. And so that you can show that you could take up additional responsibilities and be a true asset to a team. So in this role here, I was very lucky because I was actually a module coordinator. And what that meant was I actually wrote the exams, and I did everything from start to finish of that entire course. I was the teacher. I marked all the exams. I wrote the exams. I did everything. And I was very lucky to get to work with this organization. I think it's quite unusual though. I think most people have more what's kind of below here, which is the undergraduate and master's side here, where you might do some lectures. Speaking of which, if you can, as a PhD student especially, and postdoc, if you can provide lectures, ask your professor. If you can do a public lecture, either to the actual public, that's a very good thing to have in your CV as well, or general lectures to undergraduate and masters. I've done a few of these when I've been here in the computing science department. I've done some lectures on behalf of Professor Banzaf, teaching some of evolutionary computation. And this is good because not only does it show to the people here that you're capable of doing lectures, but also something you can add into your CV and say that you have experience with. If you want to apply to be a lecturer, why would they possibly hire you if you've never lectured, right? You need to have some kind of experience. I'm quite happy to say that I've now got hundreds of hours of lecturing down. And if you haven't started doing lecturing as a PhD student or as a postdoc, I recommend you start doing some. That goes the same for mentoring. If you can mentor anybody who's at a lower level than you, please do so. If you can get a mentor who's at a higher level than you, like if you are a PhD student, you should talk to a postdoc occasionally about your career, or a professor about your career. Same with an undergrad to a PhD student, and so on. That sort of back and forth is very, very useful, and each way is something you can put on your CV. Also, speaking of CVs in general, a good thing to do is CVs are something that are dynamic and grow over time. And also the expectations of what should be in a CV changes over time. I think if we looked at CVs from 50 years ago, they would look drastically different as to a CV today. So I recommend that what you also do is sit down with friends and colleagues and occasionally help each other with your CVs. So send each other links to the Overleaf document or to the Word document that you're using, and actually help each other write each other and provide feedback for each other's CVs. A common issue with CVs and with job applications is inherent systemic sexism, which is, generally speaking, because of the culture that we're in, women are taught at a young age to generally be less proactive and courageous about their own personal efforts and abilities. And this is something that needs to be combated. And the best way to do this is to review it with your peers. Sit down, look at it, and look over it. If, generally speaking, if you look at anonymous, this has been proven in studies, that if you generally look anonymously at CVs that are split by gender, you'll find that CVs written by women are statistically generally less impressive because of the fact that they will undersell themselves. And this is something that needs to be highlighted and that you need to focus on and needs to be helped by group effort, in my opinion. And it needs to be overcome, because this is the best way to overcome disparity in the statistics of gender in the sciences. So please reach out to your colleagues for help. Reach out to me for help if you want any additional information or feedback on CVs. I'm happy to help. Okay. After all the specifics of teaching here, I then go into my key skills. This is something that you should be able to read as a glance, and you should be able to provide examples to each of these as well. So if you go into an interview and they say, "Oh, you mentioned you're an advocate for equality. How have you done that?" Don't just put something that you think sounds good. Make sure you have examples available. So I could say here, for example, that I was a member of Athena Swan, which is an advocacy group for equality in the UK for the sciences, for getting more women into STEM, right? Same with any of these. If you ask me any of these, I should be able to provide examples of every single one. Additionally, you'll notice that I don't just say, I'm a good communicator. I try to use different descriptions here. So effective, efficient, excellent, logical, and analytical. Try to show a bit of verbosity here and some consideration behind your skills. It might separate you from the crowd a little bit. This is the section that sometimes some people dislike. And in my opinion, this is one of the most important parts of a CV. I think what really separates a good employee and a good researcher from the average person is showing that they're passionate. Now that sounds like some generic jargon, something that somebody would say, but I do really mean expressing passion by showing hobbies and such, showing that you don't just do this in your job description, you do extracurricular things. For example, hosting skill workshops like this. I'm not paid to do this. I do this because I think it's important to do so, and I'm passionate and want to help people. I also mentioned that I've done paper reviewing, right? If you have the opportunity to do paper reviewing from any level, from PhD up, I would say, from PhD student up, please take part in paper reviewing. That, even if that's not necessarily for a publisher or a conference, if you can just do paper reviewing for your professor, that's still a useful skill and something you can put in your CV. Eventually, once you start publishing, you will eventually get asked to officially do some paper reviewing. But you can also do it on behalf of or alongside your professor and get some assistance with that. And again, that's from PhD level up. I wouldn't expect any undergrads to be doing that. However, you can maybe do that as a group. There are sometimes research groups do sessions where they review papers, and you should definitely take part in these things if you can. Because it teaches you how to write papers better if you can actually look at papers in a critical manner. Additionally, we should also be reviewing each other's papers. So if you are in the middle of writing a paper, you should at some point before sending it to a conference or to a journal, you should send it to your colleagues for peer review internally, because they can probably catch some issues before you go through the very lengthy time process of submitting a paper for review. You don't want to get failed for something that could have been caught early on. I also have invited seminars here, and I have examples. So the links here are either links to the universities and the specific groups that I went to, or links to YouTube videos. So and when I can't go external, so when, for example, during COVID here, I couldn't go to external universities and do seminars and present my research. So I did it via Zoom in the only way I could. I recommend you guys do the same. PhD students and up, especially if you're going to be looking for jobs soon, send out the odd email to universities that you're willing to travel to for free on your own budget and present to, or present by Zoom. Because generally speaking, this is something that you can put in your CV. It increases your ability to do public speaking, as well as being able to present your work. These are really important, and it helps you network. You will meet people who could potentially hire you. I got this job because I went to a conference and presented my work, and I talked to Wolfgang Banzhaf in the Czech Republic, right? We were at a conference there and we chatted, and he mentioned there was a job available. That's how I found out about it. He recommended me to Cedric, and I applied for the job that way. And that networking is how I got my job. So I highly recommend that you present your work as frequently as you can, at least once every 3 months, ideally. Of course, COVID always makes it difficult, but you know what I mean. Lastly, the hobbies section. Again, this is what I was talking about, passion. I like to show that I have passion. I like to show that I have hobbies that are not just, I go home and sit in front of the TV, or I go home and watch Netflix for 6 hours every night. I think you should try and show that you have some interest in other things, be it sports, be it photography, be it crafting clay. It doesn't really matter. You may think it seems silly for a CV, but I truly do believe that showing your passion, showing that you have a varied and are an interesting person, half of applying for a job is not just the qualifications, but also showing that you're someone people would like to work with. And I think this is a good way of doing that. I also like to have links throughout my CV where I can to show proof of various things. So my publications have links, my hobbies have links, and so on. And there's a reason for that. And that's because in academia, you are very present online. When you look around different websites and you Google your name, you should be Googleable. And if you Google any professor, you should be able to find all their publications. You should be able to find a website detailing their projects and their works, maybe some of the code they've produced, and so on. And so that's the next part I want to sort of go on to here. But let me first just show you the LaTeX document here of my CV before we do continue. I see everybody's clicked on it. Thank you very much for looking. So in here, on the left-hand side is the code. On the right-hand side is the live PDF. You can click download to get a copy of the PDF as well, if you so please. I've tried to put some comments throughout, so it's a little bit easy to use. Feel free to make a copy of this, of the source code, and make your own version based on this. That's absolutely fine. I did not create the original version. I believe I got it from a template on Overleaf itself, and then I formatted it to how I like it. But feel free to use this. I personally really like this format. I think it looks really clean, easy to read, and very distinct structure. So, you know, clear big sections with underlines for extracurricular, key skills, teaching experience, research experience, grants and funding, publications, overview, positioning statement. And then there's subsections within there to make it nice and easy to see where everything is. On the left-hand side, I try to have everything looking fairly nice because this is public as well, right? As you can see with the link that I provided, employers can also look at this document and see how I write my LaTeX. This is actually quite a useful, almost kind of sneaky way of showing that you have LaTeX skills. If you can share your CV as an overleaf link, they see that you can write in LaTeX. And that's a good way of expressing that you have that skill. And that's important in research, especially in computing science, less so in animal sciences. But still, it's not a bad skill to be able to show. Plus, having this dynamic link that you can share out, it means that if you send this out while you're a PhD student and they look at it 3 years later when you're a postdoc, they'll see the updated version. This is a dynamic link. So if I edit this live, you would see the edit. That's very, very useful, having a dynamic link for your CV. So before I go any further, let me show you where else I like to show my CV, and that's my personal website. This is not something that you must have, and please don't feel pressured to. A lot of places have, universities allow you to have your own public domain within the university's system. And I recommend making use of this because it's free usually, and it's part of the university ecosystem. We have our own website, both in the Banzhaf lab and in Gondrel lab, we have our own websites. I recommend that whoever you find out who's administrating your website locally, and you add to that to make sure that your section looks professional, because sometimes you'll get headhunted that way. Here's an example. This is the MSU Quantitative Genetics Lab. So if you click on people here, you'll see all the different people in here. There's Cedric, right? You can see his picture, quickly see his rundown of his qualifications and his main research interests and his email, right? Nice and easy. And then down here, we've got links as well to his ResearchGate and his NCBI. So that's useful. Here's mine. Mine's is similar. I have a lot more links because I like to, like I said, I like to show that I'm passionate with things. So I have a lot more links in here. But mine's is very much the same otherwise. This is a nice, clean, and easy format. And if you have access to one of these websites, be sure to keep it updated, because it's not the person who's the administrator of the website is not going to care to do this for you. You're going to need to be the one who updates it and passes on what to update with, right? Okay, so alongside that, I've got my own personal website as well. You don't have to have this, but if you're computing science, you kind of are expected to have some basic web development skills. And if you're going into academia, you're going to be expected to be able to teach. So if you can show that you have a website, it's another way of kind of sharing those skills that you have in a simple manner. So if everybody looks at this website, my website, and goes to view the source, they can look at it and see this is actually some really nicely written code with this very nicely detailed. There's comments throughout, and it's easy to understand, right? It's not some automated thing. This was all mostly handwritten from a template. And that's good, because any potential employer can look at this and say, oh, okay, he knows how to develop code. I can see it. This is a proof. This is proof of the pudding. So this is my research page. On my analytics, I look at this occasionally. I usually get about 30 to 50 hits a day, a month, sorry, of people looking at this. So people do look at my research through my website. That's a fact. This isn't just me looking at myself and for my own personal gratification. People do look at this, and that's because of two reasons. One, I've got my CV on here. I've installed it as a PDF, so that people can use their native viewer, wherever their PDF viewer is, and actually pops up inside the browser, and then they can look through it just as we did. That's incredibly useful. That being said, I make sure I don't have my address on here, right? I have my email, but I don't have my address or anything. I don't have my phone number here. So be careful if you want to have it this public, like I do. Make sure you don't have anything too accessible in there. And I also have links down the bottom to all of the different places I'd like people to go to, ResearchGate, LinkedIn, Google Scholar, etc. This is also my personal website, and the rest of it doesn't really matter. But I like to have just a different place where I can host my research. Also, you can't see it on the front of my website here because I have it hidden. If you go to my Google Scholar, you'll see that, well, if you clicked on any of these links, you would see that all the articles that I've produced, all the papers I've produced, are hosted in various places online. I also host the author copy on my website. So that means regardless of what other institutions may or may not fall, or maybe hacked, or whatever else, there's always a copy of my paper on my website that's not hidden behind a paywall. A big problem in research these days is that, generally speaking, when you write a paper, you send off to a publisher, they'll hide it behind a paywall. And that means that your research is not available to the average person. And a lot of students out there, especially in the less developed countries, can't afford access to these papers. And they're not going to go and spend, $50 US to get access to read a paper. And some of those universities don't even have publication access. So that means that, you will not get citations in some cases because of that. So I recommend, if you can, host the author's copy before it gets sent off to get corrected from the journals or from conferences on your personal website after the whole thing's been published. That way everybody has access to your research. I highly recommend this. I also host all my research where I can on ResearchGate as well. Sorry, the Zoom window is getting in the way. So ResearchGate is a very useful website for hosting your research and also being part of the community and so on. I honestly don't use it too much. I'm not a big fan of ResearchGate, but I'm aware that a lot of people do use it, mostly so they can access papers that are otherwise behind paywalls. So make sure that when you put your research up here, your papers, that you do also have either the data and or the paper up here as well. The cool thing about this as well is you can often see statistics of people who's accessing your documents and who's accessing your research. You look per once it loads, you can look per document. So this one has 300 reads, for example, Or you can go to your profile and look at the stats for your overall profile, which is also quite interesting because you can see how many people are looking at you and your research. Again, useful if you're looking for jobs. And you can look at the history as well, so you can see over the years, you should see a grow, right? You should see that going up over the years, you hope, as you stay in research. And it's very useful for that as well. I highly recommend getting a ResearchGate if you don't already have one, if you're a PhD student and above. Or if you're even an undergrad, you can have one, and just for following research is quite useful. I really do recommend a ResearchGate for those purposes. I also recommend making a Google account if you don't have one, just so that you can keep an eye on your Google Scholar. A big problem with Google Scholar is, well, I guess the problem with naming conventions of humans is that we often have a lot of the same names. So if you have a very common name, like I have a friend whose name is Sarah Thompson. I mean, you can't get really more common than that. If you don't have a Google account, it doesn't know who's who. It tries to separate by institution. So if you're Sarah Thompson at Edinburgh University and there's a different Sarah Thompson at Glasgow University, it can tell they're different. But the likelihood is, especially if you're at a big university, there could be up to 10, 20, 30, 40 people with the same name. You know, but last name Lee, for example, there's a lot of people with the last name Lee or Mohammed, right? There's lots of them, or Thompson or White. So making an account means that you can tick which ones are your articles, and that's that done. And they're curated under your profile that you can update so that, for example, here it says, you have keywords as well. So here's some very clear keywords that differentiate my research from other people's. There's my full name, my current university, and my email that's hidden there. That means that it's definitely going to be just my research here, and that helps curate it and make people, if people are trying to look at similar research, like say they find a paper that was produced 5 years ago by you, and they think, I wonder if they've done any future work, they can find out more easily by clicking on your profile this way. So present yourself on Google Scholar, it helps a lot. Okay, the other major research one is ORCID, or ORCID. So ORCID is a website that's pretty much the same as like an early version of ResearchGate, but it's very popular and very frequently used. And the idea is it's again another way of you sharing yourself online and your research and your employment and so on. It's basically a CV of sorts that you can put up here for people to explore. But the cool thing is it links directly to the DOIs. So it proves very directly which documents are yours. And it's a very clean and cut way of expressing your research online. Again, I recommend having it just so that nobody else can claim your work. I like to have a profile just so that I can be found more easily. And if anybody, it's another place so that if somebody searches the keywords for your research, they can find you, right? And that's what's useful about that. Okay, another big one. This is LinkedIn. I put quite a lot of time a few years ago into making my LinkedIn being professional and presentable. I think LinkedIn is one of those things that people will find if they search for your name, more so than for your research. And it's also one of those things that people will come across. And you want to have up to date so that when they look at your profile, they don't consider somebody else over you. You want to make sure that you have as much information up there to separate you from everybody else. So again, the about section, very quickly, a little brief summary of yourself. I also have my CV linked there, and I have my link tree as well, so they can find everything about me if they want. In your experience, make sure it's up to date. Make sure you have all of your employment and student roles up here. You can copy paste from your CV, so you only need to do this once and then copy paste the same information in there. Education as well, that's fairly easy to explain. Licenses and certifications. So if you do anything that's like online courses on, I don't know, PyLab or whatever, you can go on here and put it up here. I even have stuff from back in the day when I worked in a bar here, like my Heineken training. You don't really need that's just because that's more of a remnant of over the years. I don't really need that these days. But things like first aid and Java courses and such are useful. I think they're powerful ways of saying that you're interested in brushing up your skills and showing that you're not just sticking to skills that you learned back in your undergrad and you're now postdoc, right? You actually know how to update your skills. That's useful. Volunteer experience, again, showing that you are a passionate person is a good thing. skills and endorsements. This whole thing, I think, is a little bit of a popularity game, and in some ways that kind of repulses me, but at the same time, I also recognize that's important. So put on your skills of, especially the keywords that are most important in your research and in the development libraries and such that you use. So if you're in animal science, you probably want to have things like you want to put genomic prediction in here, or you want to put phasing and phrase and keywords like that, and then your colleagues can endorse you for that. Additionally, you can actually ask your colleagues to endorse you. You just lean over to your friend and say, hey, could you do me a favor? Can you go into LinkedIn for 2 minutes and just click endorse on a bunch of my skills that you think are appropriate? I'd really appreciate it, because I'm looking for, because my funding runs out in 3 months and I want to get another job, right? That kind of thing is really useful. Even better, recommendations. Don't just get them from random people, get them from colleagues. So I've got supervisors and colleagues over the years here that have provided me some recommendations. This is a good way of showing that people would happily publicly vet you. You know how when you put your references on your CV, or well, I didn't, but you know how people do put their references on their CV. I recommend putting references available at the bottom, by the way. I don't actually recommend putting other people's details down unless it's a private CV. But this is a good way of showing that there are people who would be willing to hire you and put their name on. Basically, there's a risk factor with employing anybody at any point, right? You never really know if the person that you're going to be employing is going to be a good asset and a good expenditure of income. So having a set of recommendations kind of shows that in the past you've got a bit of a record, especially the people who are recommending you are professors. They're putting their name on the line for you. And so I've got a lecturer at my previous university who's done this. I need to update this, actually. I should really get a couple of professors here to do the same. I've got a few lecturers and friends from previous jobs who have provided me with recommendations. I also give recommendations because I think that's a fair thing to do as well. And sometimes it can be one for the other. Like, you'll give somebody else a recommendation, they'll do it back because they feel like they should or whatever, and that's fine. I mean, that's not a bad thing. But I think you giving recommendations also shows that you're the kind of employee who expresses gratitude to your colleagues. That's not a bad thing either. Okay, the last thing I want to mention is having a recommendation letter set up as well. The further you go in your career, the more you're going to be the kind of person who needs to provide recommendation letters to people. I have a sort of generic template that I use here that I have set up. I obviously, whenever I get asked to write a letter, I'll then go to this template and I'll modify it. I've got a couple of neat features in here where you can just type in the name once and the pronouns, and it will update the rest of the document. But I still go through and actually update with relevant personal information. And that means that I can provide recommendations to people on the fly whenever they ask for it for specific employment. This isn't just for generic LinkedIn stuff. This is for if somebody applies for a job and I get asked for a recommendation. I also recommend using something with university logo and with the university name, as well as your credentials and such, just to show that you are somebody who can provide this fairly. I recommend having something that's available because it saves you a lot of time in the long run. I think I've given about 12 to 15 of these over the years to my students. And even colleagues and peers can do this as well. It doesn't have to necessarily just be supervisors that are asked. So I recommend having one of these available. This isn't so much to help you, it's just to help other people. But that's a good thing to have available as well. So I've talked for a good 40 minutes or so. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to talk about. I see there's a little bit of chat. Let me just go have a look. Okay, no problem, sir. So if anybody has anything else they want to add, I did kind of want this to be more open format, but I ended up talking too much. So please feel free to share your CVs and your experiences and your thoughts. If you want to challenge anything that I said and disagree with me, I would welcome it, because I am not perfect. I don't know everything about applying for jobs, and I don't know everything about writing CVs. I'm no expert. So if you could tell me and teach me something, that I'd be very open to that. Or if you want to echo something I've said and say that you agree with certain parts, that's also welcome. Please do share your experiences, and please turn on your microphones and the video.
Sure, I'm happy to share a few thoughts, if you don't mind.
Hi, Wolfgang. I didn't see you join. It's good to see you.
Yeah, but I don't want to overpower the questions that might come. So I'm happy to just listen and continue listening, and then maybe at some point jump in. So feel free to ask questions first.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions before Wolfgang? Or comments, opinions? Anyone want to berate me for my opinions?
I have a number of questions. So you didn't categorize the programming skill. You had a general skills section, and some of those were like really good in communication. How would you? How would I, a person like me who is in computer science, how would I organize my programming skills section? Like
That's a good question, Son. So I used to have a section that there was technical skills. I actually removed it about 6 months ago because I realized that, generally speaking, well, once you enter research, this is different for industry, of course. With industry, you have to have your skills. But with research, I don't think it matters so much, generally speaking, because I think you're kind of expected to be a bit more fluid and dynamic with your skill set. So when I came here, I was an expert in Java. I've been programming in Java for about 5-6 years, and then I got here and I haven't written a lick of Java. You know, I need to start using Python and R and MATLAB, and those are the skills I've been using now, and I had to pick those up. Those are things that I think are more useful for an interview. And I know that when I did my interview here, when I talked to Cedric and Wolfgang about my responsibilities and what kind of data I'd be using, they asked me about what my skill set was, and I explained that, you know, I've done a lot of data manipulation, so that was very useful. And they said, do you think you'd be able to learn a new language? And I said, well, yes, of course. It would just take some time. And generally speaking, that's an acceptable thing to say, but I think you just need to be truthful. I think the problem with a lot of CVs that I saw after undergraduate is I think a lot of people try to put every programming language they can think of.
Yeah.
You know, they'll say, oh, I have mostly experience with Python, but then I'm adept at these 6 other languages and a beginner at these other 10. I don't think that's useful. I think it's much more useful just to say that you, maybe to speak in abstract terms, like I worked in object-oriented programming. That's probably, if anything, what you should put. But again, it depends whether it's industry or academia. If you're applying for industry, I would have a list of skills and I would really cater them towards the job that you're applying for. So if the job says must have, I don't know, Ruby on Rails experience, then you want to have Ruby on Rails on your CV and be truthful about how much you have there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking. Any other questions or points?
Can I have a question?
Yes, Rodrigo.
Well, sometimes when we are looking for some jobs, especially in academia or some research related job, they ask to prove your skills via your publications. And sometimes you have more skills in different kind of data analysis, but sometimes you don't have them published formally in a scientific paper. Do you see any alternative to put in a CV or to prove then that you are able to do this kind of different skills that they are asking for?
Absolutely. And this is where in the final section of my CV, I have my GitHub linked. If anybody wants to go look at my GitHub, they'll see that I not only have a nice contributions over the past year, because I add stuff occasionally. Some of these are pet projects that never got published or were never supposed to be published, or just examples, or just things for my own personal learning. Other parts are actually part of publications. And this is a good way of me showing a mixed skill set. So you can see there's Jupyter Notebook, there's Java, there's Lua, Python. And I think this is a good way of showing that you have skills that you're willing to share. So if anybody asks me, do you have any skills with Python? I can say, well, if you look at my GitHub, you can see that I don't really. With Java I do, but not really Python. but you know what I mean.
Okay, that's nice, Steve. Thank you, Ken.
Okay, thanks for sharing your experience. I have a quick question.
Sure,
So
Jingjing.
how often do you update your CV and all the materials? I think every time you want to update your information, I see a lot of effort because you are managing so many materials. So what's the frequency of updating your information?
So I tend to update my CV, my overleaf document, my LinkedIn, my ResearchGate, etc. every time I get a publication. As soon as that is published, I'll put it up on everything. And the rest of it, to be honest, the rest of it doesn't really need much updating until I apply for jobs. So I think once you're in research and once you've written your main project that you're currently working on and you've got your current publications, if you apply for a new job, all you need to update is tailoring it to the new position, really, and maybe putting in some new conferences that you spoke at. But otherwise, I would suggest, generally speaking, keeping an eye on your CV throughout time and not just waiting every couple of years. I think you should update it every few months, not just for looking for jobs, but also things like grants and even applications for responsibilities within your role sometimes require looking at your CV. So I do recommend keeping that up to date because you never know what's going to happen in the future. Jobs sometimes disappear. Unfortunate circumstances can happen. Like I heard a story very sadly about one of my friends back in the UK, who the professor suddenly died, and all the funding was suddenly lost because it was handed over to another department, and the department dissolved after the professor passed away. And that's one of those kind of horror stories that you hear about. Not only is it very sad that the person died, but all the PhD students and all the master students and so on were suddenly kind of left hanging. So having your CV up to date and is probably a very safe thing to do as well. So I recommend every couple of months keeping up to date, but also whenever you're going to apply for a job, of course, having a good read through is important.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you for asking. Okay, Wolfgang, do you want to share your thoughts?
Sure. I am happy to jump in. In general, I agree with what you said, most of it. Unfortunately, I was the first 15 minutes I didn't join, so I translate. But one thing that I would want to raise with you, maybe as a discussion point, is, I mean, we are not always applying for academic jobs. So some of you might go into industry, some of you might go into other establishments. And there's a consideration now, for example, if you apply to a big company like Facebook or Google or so, these guys have started to automate the process of reviewing CVs because they get so many of them. And what you need to do to sort of stay in the game is to play the game. In other words, to have the right keywords in your CV for a particular application, for a particular job, if you target one. That's an issue you couldn't touch because I think you targeted mostly the academic side. But we have to be careful as this technology changing now, and it's crazy what people do. And they throw out, I don't know, 95, 99% of the CVs just automatically.
That's a very good point. The keyword manipulation is a very important thing, and something that you should be doing anyway, I think, naturally in your CV, because if a job says it requires 6 main skills, you should probably mention those 6 skills on your CV. And if you don't mention them by name, I think it's quite right for any employer to say, well, you're not appropriate for the position. And so the fact that even if it's automated, it means that there's no redeeming qualities. If it's automated, they can't say, well, this person is very passionate or this person has lots of experience in similar fields. They won't think about that. The automation will truly just remove it immediately. So that's a very good point, Wolfgang. That sort of keyword consideration is very important. Tailoring your CV per role.
Tailoring your CV to the particular opportunity you see. That's one point. And the other is, I think Junji asked about the how often do you do this? I personally, I'm not applying for jobs at this point because I have a permanent job, so I don't feel this pressure. But I would also say every couple of months update your materials. Now, in the case where you have different sites where you have material, of course, that's much more work than having it just on one side or on your PDF, CV, overleaf, whatever it is. But it certainly is important to have that. I mean, okay, for me, there were times when I couldn't do it more than twice a year. I just couldn't do it. There was no time to do it. And it tends to fall back in the priority list because there are so many other pressing things. But you have to force yourself at least every half year, I think, to update your stuff. Yeah,
Yes.
that's definitely true. One other thing that I want to mention is, I mean, it's just a material to get into a discussion with a potential employer. So the real test, I think, comes when you are going for or are selected for interview. So, but that's sort of maybe out of scope of this workshop. I just want to mention that it's important to keep in mind that the material you prepare for in your CV is just an opening move by you, and then there follow many others for the job thing. And in many cases, it falls through on that very first moment. So you sort it out and your CV is not considered. So there's a balance also in terms of how much you have on paper. I've seen many CVs. That was in academia where I was involved in I'm still involved in selecting people. And sometimes a too prosaic CV can turn me off because I have to look through 100 of them. So what I mean is you need to be concise with what you write and keep it to the important things. Yes, the hobby stuff is also, it shows that you're doing more than just your job. That's good. It gives a personal flavor to it. But just don't overdo the stuff so that people are forced to read through, I don't know how many pages then.
Absolutely. Don't share your personal writing in there that's 6 pages long for sure.
Yeah.
One other aspect that I didn't mention actually is the cover letter as well. So cover letters, generally speaking, I have a format that I stick to where I have my introductory paragraph, which is where I show that I have an understanding of the role. I read through the offer or the job posting, and I discuss the university generally as an abstract entity or the research institution. And I discuss maybe talk about. Maybe I'll drop a couple of facts to show that I care and I've done some research and say, well, I know that MSU first started in this year, and I know that Animal Science Department has this kind of experience with these famous researchers and has made these big contributions, and show that you've made some research into the institution you're applying for. Similarly, for the professor you're applying to, show that I really want to work with you in particular because of your experience with this, and this. Show that you have really made some thought about this position. Is not a generic letter, because there's nothing worse than receiving a generic cover letter. And then talk about why you're appropriate for the role. In a single paragraph, maybe just 4 or 5 sentences, explain the key skills that you have, why you think you are appropriate, you think that you will provide for this role. Don't say anything that's at all disparaging or maybes or ifs or buts. Say, this is what I would provide. And then be very eloquent, be very professional, and sign it off in a respectful manner as well. Be sure to use dear sir, madam kind of thing. I don't know what the modern day equivalent of that is, but have a consideration of that kind of thing, and a kind regards at the end. is very important. Make sure, I also do this in LaTeX, so it looks professional. I use the letter template as well. Do you have anything to add to that, Wolfgang? You've probably seen more cover letters than I have.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, if you have, once you have sort of hit on a format that you like, then that's the thing. Exactly right about why you think, and that just shows your reflection, what your strengths are for this particular job. And yeah, and just be prepared to for many rejections regardless. And one has to, it's a question of a resonance between the employer and the employee. And if you, every time some people say, well, you're not the right person for this job, if you feel rejected yourself personally, you take it personal, that's not very healthy. I mean, it really diminishes yourself.
Yes.
So just be prepared to send this off to many different opportunities before you even get an opportunity for an interview. So that's how it is. That's how it is.
In the past 3 years, I probably applied for, like at the end of my PhD before coming here, I probably applied for like 200 jobs, 200 postings around the world. I got offered 2 in the end, and I had about 10 interviews in total. Generally speaking, if you get an interview, that means that you are one of the top 5 or top 10 candidates in terms of CV quality, in terms of qualifications only. And then when you're meeting in person, it's either to differentiate your skills from the others, but probably not. The CV probably does that. The main thing is to see how personable you are and whether they think you would fit into the team. In the end, these people will need to work next to you for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So they'll probably want to make sure they actually get on with you personally and think that you'd be a good fit for the team. So don't be, especially the CV stage, don't be put off by it if you're rejected. It just means there's another candidate or another bunch of candidates who have higher qualifications. That's all it is. I mean, if you're a fresh PhD student or a fresh undergrad student, you're going to be competing with people who have got 5, 10 years experience on the job. So it'll be difficult. It's the hardest time to get your job as your first one. Later on, it becomes easier. Anyway, as people are dropping off, is there anything else anybody wants to bring up? I think that's most of what I wanted to raise. Okay, this is recorded, so I'll be uploading it to YouTube and then sharing the link out for everybody. So thank you all for joining. I appreciate your time, and I hope this has been somewhat useful for you.